Somewhere in the South China Sea, a U.S. destroyer is dead in the water. The ship's own missile defenses intercepted 3 of the 4 anti-ship missiles that came for her. The 4th struck the forward section, flooding 2 compartments and killing 7 sailors. 200 miles to the west, a Chinese submarine has just been detected by a P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. At U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, the Operations Center is tracking simultaneous events across 3 operational areas: a planned surface action group bearing down on a Philippine Coast Guard vessel near 2nd Thomas Shoal, a PLA Air Force strike formation that crossed the median line 20 minutes ago and has not turned back, and the destroyer, dead in the water and calling for assistance. In Beijing, the Central Military Commission has been in session for 6 hours. This is not a war that anyone planned to start today. It is a war that began the way most wars begin, through a sequence of escalatory steps that each seemed manageable in isolation, until they were not. This is the command structure. Let's break it down. The South China Sea is one of the most strategically contested bodies of water on Earth. It carries approximately 1/3 of global maritime trade by value, an estimated $5 trillion in shipping annually. China's claim encompasses what Chinese maps depict as the 9-dash line, a boundary claiming approximately 90% of the sea's area. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that this claim had no basis in international law. China rejected the ruling. It has had no practical effect on Chinese behavior. China's construction of artificial islands on previously submerged reefs, particularly Mischief Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, and Subi Reef, has created military installations with runways, radar systems, anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile batteries, and port facilities capable of supporting operations throughout the sea. The South China Sea scenario is distinct from the Taiwan scenario. A confrontation there does not necessarily involve a Chinese attempt to seize Taiwan. It could arise from a much more limited incident. The lower trigger threshold makes it, in some ways, the more likely near-term flashpoint. The analytical case rests on 3 specific structural factors. First, the frequency of interaction. U.S. and Chinese military and paramilitary forces interact in the South China Sea more frequently than in any other location. Second, the ambiguity of the rules of engagement. A South China Sea incident could involve a Coast Guard vessel, a maritime militia fishing boat, or a PLA Navy ship, whose legal characterization would be actively contested while events were moving at naval speed. Third, the Philippine Treaty Commitment. The U.S. has explicitly stated that the Mutual Defense Treaty applies to Philippine Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea. This creates a specific trigger architecture that links a confrontation over a small feature with the full weight of the alliance relationship. The PLA's Southern Theater Command, headquartered in Guangzhou, is the operational command responsible for the South China Sea. The South Sea Fleet's submarine force, including nuclear-powered attack submarines based at the Yulin Tunnel Complex on Hainan, provides the most strategically significant naval capability in the theater. Fiery Cross Reef, with its 3,000-meter runway, provides a land-based air operations capability in the middle of the South China Sea. The HQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missile systems deployed on these features extend the Chinese air defense umbrella across a substantial portion of the sea. A carrier strike group, centered on a Nimitz or Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, is the standard U.S. naval formation for power projection in the Western Pacific. The carrier's air wing includes approximately 60 to 70 aircraft. F/A-18 Super Hornets for strike and air superiority, or E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for airborne early warning and battle management, and EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare. The U.S. submarine force is the least visible, but potentially the most operationally decisive element. Virginia, Los Angeles, and Seawolf-class attack submarines operate throughout the Indo-Pacific at depths and in areas that make their specific positions unknown to adversaries. The Philippines' willingness to honor the EDCA in a real crisis, to allow U.S. combat aircraft and ships to use Philippine bases for offensive operations, cannot be assumed in advance. The Philippines is a state with its own domestic political constraints, economic relationships with China, and a strategic calculus that does not automatically align with U.S. preferences. The Carrier Strike Group is the most powerful conventional military formation in the world, and in the South China Sea, it would be operating within parameters that PLA anti-access systems were specifically designed to challenge. The DF-21D, with a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers, and the DF-26, with its 4,000-kilometer range, create an engagement envelope that covers the entire South China Sea. Whether these systems can reliably strike a carrier strike group that is maneuvering at high speed with electronic warfare support and active missile defense is an operationally contested question. But the existence of the capability changes the tactical geometry of carrier operations in ways that cannot be ignored. What the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile is a supersonic sea-skimming weapon with a range of approximately 540 kilometers that makes a terminal approach at Mach 3, giving defenders a very short engagement window. The artificial island installations in the Spratlys are themselves missile platforms. Striking them constitutes a strike on Chinese territory and therefore carries its own escalation implications. U.S. attack submarines are assessed as substantially superior to Chinese counterparts in acoustic quieting, sensors, and crew training. The South China Sea's shallow waters in many areas complicate submarine operations for both sides. Shallow water limits acoustic propagation in ways that affect sonar performance. Anti-submarine warfare in the South China Sea involves P-8A Poseidon aircraft dropping sonobuoys, MH-60R helicopters conducting dipping sonar searches, surface combatants towing array sonars, and fixed underwater surveillance arrays. Modern naval warfare depends on a kill chain, the sequence from sensor detection through data processing to weapons targeting. Its disruption is as operationally significant as weapons performance itself. China's over-the-horizon radar systems are designed to provide targeting data for anti-ship ballistic missiles against targets beyond the horizon. Their ability to reliably track a maneuvering carrier strike group with electronic warfare support is an intelligence question whose answer is not publicly established. Cyber operations would be employed by both sides from the earliest stages. Chinese cyber capabilities would target U.S. command and control networks and logistics systems. U.S. with cyber capabilities would target the Chinese targeting chain, the radar networks and battle management systems connecting sensor to shooter. A Philippine supply vessel, making a routine run to Second Thomas Shoal, is surrounded by China Coast Guard cutters and maritime militia fishing boats. Water cannons are used. The supply mission is blocked. A U.S. destroyer is dispatched to escort the next Philippine resupply mission. A planned frigate cuts across her bow. The ships pass within 150 meters. There is no collision. This time, the incident is reported to both capitals within minutes. The diplomatic machinery that might have contained it is slower than the operational machinery. The de-escalation window closes. Within 24 to 48 hours, both sides are mobilizing at a pace visible to intelligence services. As China's Southern Theater Command activates, the South Sea Fleet's surface combatants begin moving from port. Submarines sortie from Yulin. PLAAF strike aircraft disperse to multiple southern airfields. DF-21, D and DF-26 units placed on elevated alert. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command repositions. The carrier strike group in the Philippine Sea turns toward the South China Sea. B-1B bombers at Guam are uploaded with anti-ship missiles and brought to alert. Additional attack submarines are directed to key positions. Philippines invokes the Mutual Defense Treaty. U.S. authorizes defensive operations only, not yet offensive strikes. This political constraint shapes the entire first phase of military confrontation. The transition from confrontation to open combat occurs when a PLA submarine fires on a U.S. surface vessel. A PLAN submarine commander is tracking a U.S. carrier strike group at close range, makes the decision to fire before the U.S. force can attack him. The initial YJ-18 salvo is detected by the carrier strike group's E-2D Hawkeye at a range of approximately 200 nautical miles. The FA-18S on combat air patrol are vectored. The SM-6 batteries on the destroyers go to engagement readiness. The EA-18G Growlers begin jamming. The majority of the incoming YJ-18S are intercepted. One hits a destroyer. The damage is severe. Simultaneously, PLAAF aircraft strike U.S. and Philippine air base infrastructure on Palawan. The carrier retreats east, outside the DF-21D engagement envelope, while continuing to launch strikes with standoff weapons and tomahawks. This retreat is not defeat. The carrier's aircraft can still strike targets at considerable range, but it is a concession of operational space. U.S. attack submarines prosecute planned surface combatants. The undersea engagement is the dimension of the conflict in which U.S. advantage is clearest. Fiery Cross and Subi reefs are targeted by Tomahawk and JASS-MER. Their survivability under precision strike attack determines whether the Chinese A2/AD bubble contracts significantly or holds. The Philippines, having sustained direct attack on its territory, is now firmly in the conflict. China's ability to threaten the Philippines economically through trade restrictions, debt leverage, and diaspora pressure is an instrument of coercion operating in parallel with the military campaign. Japan contributes intelligence sharing and logistical support from the beginning. Its direct military participation escalates incrementally as the conflict's scope expands. Australia provides submarine intelligence and P-8A augmentation. The question of direct submarine engagement is a cabinet decision. The scenario's dynamics are pressing toward, but have not yet forced. The nuclear dimension cannot be ignored. Both the United States and China possess nuclear arsenals. A conventional war that begins to go seriously against China in ways that threaten the regime's legitimacy or territorial integrity could create pressure on nuclear doctrine that the doctrine was not designed to handle. A coercive pause is, as in other conflict scenarios, historically the most likely resolution outcome. China, having suffered significant naval losses to U.S. submarine and air attack, and faces a military situation deteriorating relative to its initial position. The United States, having defended its treaty ally and demonstrated capability, has achieved a demonstration of resolve without decisively defeating China. A negotiated pause through intermediaries follows. Neither side characterizes it as a concession. The underlying strategic situation is largely unchanged. The scenario suggests that neither side would achieve uncontested sea control. China's A2/AD architecture makes sustained U.S. surface operations in the western portion very costly. U.S. submarine and long-range air power makes Chinese surface freedom similarly costly. The result? A contested maritime environment in which both sides can contest, but neither can dominate. An operationally costly stalemate that neither side's doctrine is fully designed to manage. The Philippines' experience would be the defining test of the Mutual Defense Treaty's practical meaning. A Philippine government that maintains alliance solidarity under Chinese pressure demonstrates credibility to every other regional state. A Philippine government that accommodates Chinese pressure demonstrates the opposite. The AUKUS framework's operational effectiveness in its early stages would be demonstrated by the conflict. The South China Sea carries approximately 1/3 of global maritime trade by value. Even a partial closure would cascade through global supply chains within days. The Strait of Malacca carries approximately 80% of China's oil imports. U.S. and allied naval forces in the Indian Ocean could interdict this traffic without entering the South China Sea, a strategic lever that significantly complicates China's war termination calculus. The first lesson: carrier survivability against DF-21D attack. If carriers prove vulnerable, the entire U.S. power projection model requires fundamental revision. If they prove survivable, the A2/AD concept as a barrier to U.S. force projection is less effective. The second, artificial island survivability under sustained precision strike. If they can be rapidly suppressed, China's A2/AD bubble is less durable. If they prove resilient, they represent a permanent change in Western Pacific strategic geography. The third, submarines as the primary instrument of sea denial. The ASW contest would be the most consequential military engagement of the war. The fourth, political durability of alliances under simultaneous military stress and economic coercion. The states whose political systems can sustain this pressure, and those that cannot, would reshape the alliance architecture for decades. A U.S.-China naval war in the South China Sea has not happened. What the analysis establishes is the structure of the problem. The frequency of interaction creates a structural risk of incident that no amount of diplomatic architecture can fully eliminate. The artificial island installations have changed the strategic geography in ways that cannot be reversed without military action that China would characterize as an act of war. China's gray zone strategy, designed to avoid triggering U.S. military response, is also progressively changing the political and military facts on the water in ways that make open conflict more, not less, likely over time. The escalation ladder that China is using to consolidate its South China Sea position may eventually require a rung that crosses the threshold it has been carefully avoiding. Structure shapes what is possible. In the South China Sea, the structure has been changing, quietly, relentlessly, and in ways that matter. You have been watching The Command Structure. Subscribe if you think in systems.